Mutual's Special Features Division, through the Don Lee Station in Hollywood, now brings you a personal interview with one of the heroes of the March of Death, Captain Samuel C. Grashio, now of the 4th Air Force. And here to talk with Captain Grashio is the well-known news commentator, Harrison Wood. Mr. Wood.
General Douglas MacArthur from his headquarters on New Guinea said this morning that the stories of Japanese atrocities speak for themselves. After you hear what Captain Grashio has to say, you will appreciate more than ever the horrifying facts that were known to General MacArthur when he said, "I was the leader of that lost cause, and from the bottom of a seared and stricken heart, I pray that merciful God may not delay too long the delivery of our brave men, that their day of salvation be not so far removed that they perish, that it be not again too late." Last night, ladies and gentlemen, I heard Captain Grashio talk for 3 hours at an Army-sponsored press conference. The details were so harrowing that several women, including Mrs. William Dice, widow of the commanding officer in the Philippines, was ushered from the room. The slender 25-year-old captain, with haunted gray eyes and a thin young face, spoke with a boyish voice that had a curious deadness in it. But the lad from Spokane, Washington, had a real story to tell. Sitting beside Captain Grashio at this microphone is Colonel Snavely, commanding the Los Angeles Fighter Wing of the 4th Air Force. Colonel, will you be good enough to present the captain to this coast-to-coast mutual audience?
Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Samuel C. Grashio, AAF, formerly of the 5th Air Force, now of the 4th Air Force, wears the Distinguished Service Medal with 2 silver stars. His foreign service dated from November the 1st, 1941 to November the 20th, 1943. He escaped from a Jap prison camp in Davio on the island of Mindanao. Last April, after more than a year of brutalizing imprisonment, under which thousands of American and Filipino soldiers were beaten, starved, and tortured to death. We have only a few minutes on the air, so I'm going to ask you to begin your story when and where you please.
Well, Colonel, I'm here today because I followed Colonel Dias out. To me, he was the greatest man in the war. On the day we surrendered, we had been trying to equip a boat for escape, but were seized when 2 Jap tanks approached, escorted by a 5th columnist. Even after white flags had been flown, Jap dive bombers killed many unarmed American and Filipino troops in cold blood. We already were haggard and starved when, on the morning of April 10th, the Japs rounded up the prisoners at Maravelis Bay and searched us. They took my wristwatch, some money, a ring, and my crash bracelet. It was stifling hot in the sun, but they kept us out there in it for 3 hours for no reason at all, except that they wanted to give us the sun treatment. They took our hats away from us. Anyone who has ever been in the Philippines knows what it is to stand in the blazing sun for 10 minutes without a hat, let alone 3 hours. Then in groups of 100, we began the March of Death. Their way of giving us directions was to swat Americans with the butts of their rifles, and as we marched, passing Japs would throw up their hands and laugh in mockery of our surrender. It's a good thing we didn't know what was ahead of us. We marched 140 miles to San Fernando, and every mile was marked by new methods of torture and brutality. They gave us no food and no water, 19 kilometers beyond our defense lines, as we plodded along without food or water, under the grueling sun and under almost constant beatings with fists and rifle butts. We came upon hundreds of bodies of American and Filipinos. They had been shot or bayoneted. That far from where the fighting had taken place, the poor fellows could only have been murdered in cold blood. Not all the prisoners were removed from the area at once. Many Americans were kept behind to set up the Japanese artillery. That was to hammer Corregidor into surrender. The Japs knew our guns wouldn't fire as long as Americans were there. But later, a good many of our boys were killed by our own fire, used as shields by the Japs. On the first day's march, a young lieutenant sat down to take off his old shoes and put on a new pair he was carrying. A young Jap soldier came up, smashed him in the face with the butt of his rifle. took both pair of shoes, and the lieutenant marched those 7 days over base rock gravel, barefoot. I saw him afterwards. His feet were just a mass of festering blisters. Every step must have been agony.
Captain, you said something last night about one of our boys being run down by a Jap tank.
Yes, we were so weak and so sick that we just looked on in horror. The words had come down the line that Jap sentries up ahead were striking all the boys on the head if they wore helmets. They hit them with 2x4s as they passed. Well, I threw my helmet in a ditch, but Colonel Dias didn't. They hit him and knocked him clear off the road into the ditch. I tried to help, but they pounced on me, beat me up, and forced me to go on. Japs in trucks, passing in the opposite direction, stuck out their rifle butts, clipping all the boys they could reach in the face. Then along came a Jap tank. I saw it deliberately swerve out of its course, run down an American soldier who had fallen behind a little, and crush his body into the gravel as flat as a pancake. He couldn't get out of its pathway in time. The Japs screamed and hollered with glee and spit at everyone they could in passing. It was deliberate murder, but we hadn't seen anything yet. The dysentery, diarrhea, malaria, and tropical ulcers became prevalent by the third night when we got to a place called Hermosa. That's the place where a Jap superior private, that's roughly equivalent to a corporal in our army, clubbed me across the face for no reason at all with a bamboo stick, which broke 2 of my teeth and split my mouth open. If they'd shot me, it would have been a blessing. We were starved, exhausted, dirty, crazy for a mouthful of even the filthiest water. The only water we could get was from a carabao wallows.
Captain, explain just what you mean by a carabao wallow.
It's a muddy mess where domesticated water buffaloes wallow. When the men would stagger along past one of these, they would try to scoop up a handful of the filthy, muddy water and drink it. But the Japs watched us pretty closely and would club us back into line with rifle butts. We passed some artesian wells, and the men broke like madmen to reach them, but they were beaten back unmercifully. I tried myself, but saw there was no use, and went back to the ranks. A case of milk fell from a passing Jap truck. Our men rushed for it like a swarm of ants, but the Japs beat them off with their rifles and fists and anything they could use.
Captain, you said something last night about the wounded on this march.
Yes, I saw one Filipino with both legs off, pulling himself over the hot gravel on his stomach with his hands, and Jap trucks went by without even hesitating. Many of our boys had only one leg, and the Japs forced them to keep up through all the heat and sickness. That night, 10,000 of us were packed into an area no larger than 200 yards square. Just looking in the face of the boys, you could tell they were asking themselves, why in the hell did we surrender? For 3 days without water and food, we had to stand there panting for breath and watch our captors eat. We looked like starved, skinny bums, but the skinniest bum you ever saw along a railroad track would look better than the rest of us. The guards were changed often enough so that they were always fresh, but we were forced along with bleeding, blistering feet and emaciated bodies. They even countermarched us for 14 kilometers one day for no reason other than added brutality. The rest of that march is still a bloody haze. In all that time, the only food any of us got was slipped to us by Filipinos who risked torture and death to do it. Some of them caught doing it were clubbed across the face with rifle butts. The Japs never gave any of the prisoners the slightest medical attention. Sometimes when a boy would collapse from heat and exhaustion from the fight against dysentery, the Japs would bayonet him right before our eyes. This isn't a heresy. I saw it. At one place, we had to stand guard over the garbage pits to prevent our boys from eating rotten refuse. No wonder that on a single day I counted 500 Filipino bodies being carried out for burial.
When did you get your first food, Captain?
That was not until the end of the 7-day march. Each man got a ball of rice the size of a small fist, twice a day. Sometimes a pinch of salt to go with it. Frequently, the Jap guards, with nothing else to do, would make us stand for hours in the boiling sun, ostensibly for the purpose of counting us. Those who couldn't move, unaided, were beaten savagely. Arriving at San Fernando at the end of 7 days without food, most of the Americans had developed amoebic dysentery. We were packed like pigs for 3 days in a tin-roofed building.
Well, how hot do you think it was in there, Captain?
Well, Mr. Wood, I judge it was 125 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, just try and imagine, if you can, that there were no sanitary facilities at all. Due to their illness, most of the men would have been unable to use them in any case. Our pride had degenerated. We had only pity for those who were sicker than we were, and there was nothing we could do. There was a little AAF boy laying out there. He was lying naked out by a garbage pit. He was nothing but skin and bones. He was almost gone from chronic dysentery. The blowflies were literally eating him alive. I asked him if I could do anything, and he still had his American decency and pride, even if we were existing like the lowest animals by then. He whispered that he wanted me to take him away somewhere so the other boys wouldn't have to look at him dying like a rat.
Well, Captain, you finally got to Camp O'Donnell. Now, just take it easy and see if you can recall what happened there.
There were 7,000 American soldiers and 40,000 Filipinos at Camp O'Donnell. In the 2 months I was there, I saw 1,100 of the Americans and 14,000 of the Filipinos die. Most of them had been living and sleeping in their own defecation for weeks. One day they sent me with 200 other human skeletons to load 158-pound bags of rice. A Japanese officer had climbed up on a box to tell us through an interpreter that we were not prisoners of war. We were Japanese captives and would be treated as such. He told us to have nothing to do with Filipino civilians, not even to speak to them. While we were working, a little Filipino boy tried to give me some sugar cake and couldn't understand why I wouldn't take it. I didn't see any Japs watching me, so I accepted it. But 2 sentries down the line had seen it. They beat the little boy to a bloody pulp and then put me in a circle of 5 guards. They took me into a building and forced me to stand at attention. Then one of them started to beat me up. He gave me a black eye, split my lips, and bloodied my nose. Then he kicked me savagely below the belt. I stayed on my feet, although I couldn't stand up straight, and they all spit on me. Then they made me bow to them. There were 1,500 American soldiers crowded into a room about 3 times the size of the studio around an open latrine. All the men had on at that time were shirts or pieces of torn cloth tied around their middles. Their bodies looked like Venetian blinds. Once, when a little Filipino Red Cross nurse attempted to help, she was beaten up just as badly as the men. It was at Camp O'Donnell that I got my first bath. During a rainstorm, I stood under the eaves of a grass-roofed hut and let the water run over me. There were only 2 little water spigots for 7,000 Americans. I stood in line for 8 hours once for a small canteen full of water. The boys began to suffer terribly from both wet and dry beriberi. Some of them were afflicted with elephantiasis, so badly that they looked like zombies. Their bodies below the waist were tremendous, but above they looked like nothing but ribs.
By the way, Mr. Wood, let me say right here that from the time of Captain Gracio's escape from the Japanese until yesterday, the requirements of military security sealed his lips concerning any and all of his experience as a Japanese prisoner of war. He could not even tell his own friends or the members of his own family any of these details. That is forbidden of all escaped prisoners, and anyone should remember that for the sake of our men who are still subject to Japanese atrocities. Yesterday, by special direction of Army Air Forces to Major General William E. Lind, commanding officer of the 4th Air Force, Captain Grashio was permitted for the first time to break silence.
Thank you very much, Colonel Snavely, and of course, we all thank you, Captain Grashio. Ladies and gentlemen, if we've been shocked by what Captain Grashio has told us, it's because we haven't learned our Japanese. We heard about these things happening to the Chinese and the Koreans and the Manchurians, but the general reaction seemed to be it will never happen to us. But it has, and it may happen in even greater degree. And now, Gordon Burke.
Mutual Special Features Division, through the Don Lee station in Hollywood, KHJ, has brought you a personal interview with one of the heroes of the March of Death, Captain Samuel C. Grashio, now of the 4th Air Force. Captain Grashio was interviewed by the well-known news commentator, Harrison Wood. This is Mutual.